Jaime Lannister never lost his hand. On the day that changed his fate, when he was taken captive at the Whispering Wood, he found a stroke of fortune amid tragedy. Instead of a blade cleaving his flesh, he ended up with a deep gash on his forearm. It hurt like 7 hells, and he carried the scar forever after. But his sword hand remained unscathed, as quick and deadly as ever. This single difference rippled through the currents of his life, altering the stories told in taverns and the destinies of those who crossed his path. Men still whispered about the kingslayer's infamy, but they also spoke in hushed voices of the legendary skill that even the finest knights dared not challenge lightly. And in King's Landing, beneath red and gold banners draped over towering walls, Jaime walked with an air of quiet confidence, flexing the fingers of his right hand whenever he thought of all he might have lost. That hand was more than just flesh and bone. It was his identity, the means by which he had survived every brutal test life had thrown at him. His return to the capital after captivity still carried the heavy undertones of shame and resentment, but not the same undertones that would have followed if he had come back maimed. The city watch, the gold cloaks, greeted him with wary respect. They all had heard he was held prisoner by the Northmen, but now he stood tall, wearing the crimson cloak of a Lannister with the proud stance of someone who had won a private war. Cersei was waiting for him in her private chambers. She did not rush to him in full view of everyone, but her green eyes flashed with a combination of relief, concern, and possessive desire when he found her at last. She brushed the scar on his forearm with her fingertips, her lips curved in a wry smile. He was hers, had always been hers, and she had worried that losing his hand might cost him part of his spirit. Instead, he remained physically whole, and the spark of arrogant brilliance still shone in his eyes. Even so, his captivity in the north had changed him. It had made him question loyalty, oaths, and honor. It had made him question everything except the link he shared with Cersei, that secret bond that kept him tethered to her above all else. Though he was not so battered as he might have been, rumors of his captivity spread. Men at court speculated that he must have bargained with the Starks in some underhanded way to preserve his hand. Others believed he had been too valuable a hostage to cripple. In truth, the wound he suffered was enough to remind him of mortality, yet not so grave as to rob him of his greatest asset. He was placed under guard, forced to wear manacles briefly, and then, through the chaotic shifts in alliances, he was eventually allowed to return south. There was no monstrous father of a Sellsword to slice off his hand, no mocking laughter as he faced the prospect of a world without his famed swordsmanship. Instead, he'd arrived back in King's Landing with a throbbing arm and a sense of deep unrest that no one else could quite name. The day he visited the training yard, still adjusting to the sights and smells of the capital, he wanted to test his reflexes. He needed to feel that everything he was had not diminished. Drawing his sword, he found a willing partner in a bold young knight who sought to win favor by dueling the kingslayer. The crowd murmured, half expecting to see whether Jaime's captivity had softened him. In moments, the yard rang with the music of steel on steel. Jaime's agility shone. He sidestepped the knight's thrust, spun around, and let his blade glide through the air as if it knew the dance by heart. The younger knight came at him again, only to find his weapon batted aside by effortless grace. After a dozen passes, Jaime disarmed him and knocked him flat on the ground, the tip of his sword poised at the man's throat. Silence fell before scattered applause. Jaime stepped back, lifted his blade in a small salute, and then sheathed it. He felt relief flood through him. He was still himself, Jaime Lannister, the greatest swordsman in the realm, the man who had once ended a king's reign with a single stroke. Yet retaining the hand that slew the Mad King meant facing the full weight of his history without the forced humility of a lost limb. Men feared him more openly. Knights who might have sniffed at a maimed man simply kept their distance. He still held a place in the Kingsguard, where his white cloak mingled with the Lannister crimson he wore underneath. King Joffrey, though a product of Jaime's secret relationship with Cersei, did not treat him with warm affection. The boy king was prone to cruelty, throwing tantrums over trifles, snapping at anyone who dared question him. Jaime tried to temper the boy's worst impulses, sometimes scolding him in private, but the notion of fatherly authority was complicated by the web of secrecy that bound the family. Tyrion, sharp-tongued and keen-witted, was the only one who could openly speak about Joffrey's brutal ways without losing his head. Jaime found in Tyrion a source of both frustration and fondness. He admired his brother's intellect even as he worried that Tywin, their father, would never grant Tyrion the respect he deserved. When Tywin summoned Jaime to discuss the security of King's Landing, Jaime arrived in the Hand Solar with his head held high, remembering the subtle shift in his father's gaze when he saw that Jaime's right hand remained intact. Tywin had once pinned all his hopes on Jaime's prowess, using him like a sword pointed at the realm's heart. Now, the older man remained distant but proud. Jaime could sense it in the stony way Tywin spoke, measuring each word like gold. He detailed his expectations: securing the throne, maintaining alliances, and above all, ensuring that House Lannister kept its iron grip on power. Jaime listened, but his thoughts drifted to the shape of the realm, the chaos brimming in the north, and the unpredictability of Joffrey. He remembered that once, in some half-forgotten dream, he had harbored the notion of knighthood's purity: saving the innocent, upholding the weak, defending the helpless. The kingslayer's reputation had robbed him of that dream, tarnishing the white cloak he wore. But if any glimmer of that dream remained, it was faintly alive in him, a secret he guarded even from himself. In the passing weeks, the realm seethed with rumors. Robb Stark, the young wolf, continued to win victories in the field. Stannis Baratheon brooded on Dragonstone, while Renly had been struck down by a shadow none understood. Marjorie Tyrell arrived in King's Landing as Joffrey's future bride, and though her presence infused the court with new color, it also heightened tensions. Cersei watched the Tyrell girl like a lioness ready to pounce on a threat. Jaime could almost feel the rivalry crackling whenever the two women occupied the same space. Cersei's jealousy, which had once been a source of twisted pride for him, now felt stifling. He wondered at times if their bond was a prison rather than a sanctuary, but he could never fully renounce her. She was too much a part of him, mirroring all his darkest desires and offering the promise of acceptance that no one else would ever grant. On the training ground, Jaime discovered that his captivity had sharpened his instincts. He practiced relentlessly, taking on multiple sparring partners at once. Word spread that the Kingslayer was faster than ever, his reflexes honed by the near loss of his sword hand. A few knights spoke with grudging admiration. Others, like Ser Meryn Trant or Boros Blunt, carried themselves with an undercurrent of envy, muttering that Jaime's reputation overshadowed their own. Brienne of Tarth was nowhere to be found in King's Landing, for the alternative history that had once bound her to Jaime, helping him survive the loss of his hand, never truly materialized. She remained loyal to the memory of Renly, traveling roads that kept her far from the capital. Jaime sometimes wondered about the tall, formidable woman he had briefly encountered on the battlefield, but she was only a footnote in his life, a glimpse of an unusual knightly soul who had watched him with undisguised disdain and pity. Now, without that forced companionship, Jaime's moral reflections had fewer mirrors against which to test themselves. Every few nights, Jaime dreamt of the Mad King. He saw Aerys Targaryen perched on the Iron Throne, cackling as wildfires ignited beneath the city. In those dreams, Jaime's hand seemed made of molten gold, blazing with a bright, searing heat. He would wake in a cold sweat, heart pounding, half expecting to see green flames licking the walls. But it was only the faint glow of the moon and the hush of the Red Keep's corridors. He had never been one to dwell on guilt. He acted, survived, and carried on. Yet something in the darkness whispered that his fate was not done tormenting him. That something had to do with what he had taken from the realm when he killed its king. He had saved untold thousands by slaying Aerys, but the realm saw him as an oathbreaker, and perhaps he was. The White Book of the Kingsguard recorded his deed in stark, damning lines. It offered him no redemption, no illusions. When he could not sleep, he roamed the castle halls, strolling past torchlit arches and the silent watchmen who bowed as he passed. He visited the throne room, staring at the Iron Throne with its jagged swords. He remembered how the Mad King had sat upon that monstrous seat, delirious with cruelty. Jaime remembered the moment he drove his blade through Aerys's back. Sometimes he wondered if that single act, though necessary, had set him on a path from which he would never escape. At other times, he told himself it was better to be living with the brand of kingslayer than dead and useless. If only those dream shades would leave him be. The early morning sun found him training again. He wanted no rust to settle on his skills. The swinging of a sword was his litany, and the ring of steel was his prayer. With each thrust and parry, his heartbeat slowed, his breathing evened, and the nightmares receded into the corners of his mind. Tyrion once joked that Jaime needed a sword in his hand the way a maester needed his quill. Jaime had not disagreed. Even so, occasionally a flicker of envy passed through him when he watched Tyrion navigate the labyrinth of politics. The imp could use words as deftly as Jaime used a blade. Tyrion parried arguments, thrust verbal barbs, and danced around foes in a sphere Jaime had no desire to master. But in the Game of Thrones, it was often the cunning voice that won, not the swift sword. That day, Tywin called Jaime to a council meeting with Lords Varys, Littlefinger, and Tyrion in attendance. There was news that Robb Stark had captured the crag and might push farther south. Tywin spoke of strategy, forging alliances through marriage, and the pressing need to control the Red Wine fleet. Jaime listened, arms crossed over his chest, his expression neutral. Littlefinger offered his oily suggestions. Varys chimed in with placating remarks, and Tyrion punctuated the conversation with acerbic wit. When Tywin turned to Jaime, it was not to ask for counsel but to command him. Jaime would ride west to shore up the family's territories. Kevan Lannister handled much of the day-to-day operations, but Tywin wanted his most formidable son as a living symbol of Lannister strength in the Westerlands. The presence of Jaime, undefeated and unbowed, would rally those who doubted the Lannister hold on power. Though Jaime had no interest in feudal management, he agreed. A knight belonged in the field, not rotting in a council chamber, and part of him was grateful for the chance to escape the stifling tension of King's Landing. Cersei did not hide her displeasure. She confronted him in a curt whisper after the meeting ended, gripping his forearm with nails that bit into his scar. "Father can't just send you away," she hissed. "He needs you here to protect Joffrey." Jaime tried to soothe her, brushing a strand of golden hair from her cheek. "He needs me where I can best serve the family," he replied with measured calm. "And you know I'll always do what I must to keep our son safe." Cersei's eyes flashed with frustration, jealousy, and an undercurrent of fear. Jaime recognized her fear. It was the dread that any day, the truth of Joffrey's parentage might come to light, or that the precarious balance that kept them all alive would crumble. He might have tried to say something reassuring, but she turned away, refusing to grant him the moment of tenderness he sought. Leaving King's Landing felt oddly liberating. Riding west with a column of red and gold knights behind him, Jaime recalled the time in his youth when he roamed the Westerlands, honing his prowess in small skirmishes and tournaments. Now, older and bearing his infamous epithet, he wondered if he had ever truly embraced knighthood's original purpose. He had taken vows, sworn to protect the innocent, to serve the king, to uphold justice. Then he slew the king he was sworn to protect. The realm would never forgive him, no matter the necessity. But at least he had one comfort. His hand, the same hand that had ended Aerys's life, the same hand that fought for his own survival at every turn. He told himself that if the gods had truly wanted him to pay for his crimes, they would have let fate claim that limb. Instead, he remained a swordsman of unmatched skill, and perhaps that was both blessing and curse. They passed through small villages, where common folk offered half-hearted bows. News of war, taxes, and forced levies had left many resentful. Yet some looked upon the Lannister banners with relief, hoping the presence of an army meant protection. Bandits had grown bold in wartime, and travelers along the main roads lived in fear of brigands. Jaime ordered his knights to ride in tight formation, mindful that morale among the peasants could not improve if they saw the High Lord's forces pillaging as well. He was not so naive as to believe all of his men would act like perfect knights, but he had put the fear of the kingslayer into them. He turned a blind eye to minor transgressions. Soldiers would be soldiers, and he needed them to stay loyal, but he made a show of punishing the worst offenders when word of a violent robbery reached his ears. Privately, he marveled that he cared enough to do so. One dusk, they halted near a ruin sept for the night. Jaime stood gazing at its broken arches, pondering how the realm had once revered its gods in places such as this. Now it was just rubble. Smoke from campfires curled into the twilight sky as the men settled in for the night, talking, gambling, or tending to their horses. Jaime was about to strip off his armor when he spotted a figure approaching. A young woman in patched riding clothes. She carried no sigil, no banner, but she approached with cautious confidence. "My lord," she said, a tremor in her voice that suggested both fear and determination. "I've come to petition you." Jaime raised an eyebrow. She introduced herself as the daughter of a smallholder whose fields had been burned by roving marauders. She begged for help, claiming the bandits would return soon. Jaime listened, arms folded, uncertain whether this was a trap, but the raw desperation in her eyes compelled him to question her further. Once satisfied that she spoke truth, he consulted his men. Should he divert from his father's directive to root out a small band of criminals? Tywin's orders were clear: secure the major holdfasts. Yet Jaime felt a twinge of responsibility. He decided he had enough men to spare a small patrol. That night, he dispatched a trusted knight and a dozen soldiers to the woman's homestead. Then he resumed his journey the following morning, continuing toward Casterly Rock. A small mercy, perhaps, yet one he might not have offered a few years ago. He could almost hear Tyrion's voice mocking him for discovering a conscience. But was it conscience? Or was it just an impulse to prove to himself that he was not as monstrous as people said? He rode on in silence, occasionally exchanging words with his bannermen about potential alliances and the state of the war. In private, Jaime wrestled with the idea that he had changed. Captivity had forced him to confront vulnerability. Keeping his hand had granted him the power to maintain his identity, yet also left him aware of how close he had come to losing it all. He no longer took his skill for granted. When he reached Casterly Rock, the ancestral seat of House Lannister, the sight of the colossal fortress perched on the cliffs above the sunset sea filled him with a mix of awe and sorrow. This was the place of his youth, the seat of Lannister might, the looming symbol of his father's legacy. Tywin was not present. He remained in King's Landing or off rallying forces. Kevan welcomed Jaime with the dutiful respect of a seasoned soldier. They conferred about logistical matters, the distribution of soldiers, the possibility of further raids by Stark loyalists. At the Rock, Jaime found himself mired in the practical details of administration, ensuring the storehouses were full, that the blacksmiths were forging enough weapons, that outlying villages were paying their taxes. He despised the monotony. He yearned to unsheath his sword and ride into battle, to test the edge of his blade against worthy opponents. But for the moment, there was little to do but keep everything running smoothly. The war might come their way eventually, or it might skirt the Westerlands entirely, depending on how events played out elsewhere. He had been at Casterly Rock for nearly a fortnight when word arrived that the young wolf had defeated a contingent of Lannister forces at Oxcross, dealing them a swift blow that left the realm buzzing. Jaime read the Raven's message in stony silence, then ordered a council of local lords. Kevan advised caution. The Westerlands needed to be defended, but a direct confrontation with Robb Stark could prove costly. Tywin's instructions to Jaime were to maintain control, avoid recklessness, and be ready to support the main Lannister host if needed. Jaime tried to quell the flicker of excitement he felt at the thought of crossing blades with the king in the north. Robb Stark was a formidable commander, younger and bolder than many. Jaime had faced him once and lost, albeit under difficult circumstances. Was it pride or simple duty that made Jaime long for a rematch? In the end, the decision was partly made for him. Reports came that Robb's outriders were pushing deeper into Lannister territory, threatening smaller keeps. Outrage boiled in Jaime's blood. He gathered a force, 2,000 men, cavalry and infantry combined, and set out to meet the threat. He stationed Kevin with another contingent at the rock to hold the seat. As Jaime rode out, the hush of the morning air hummed with tension. Banners snapped in the breeze, bright with the golden lion of Lannister. Soldiers murmured among themselves, well aware they might be riding to bloody conflict. The days that followed were filled with maneuvering. Jaime aimed to corner Robb's forces against the coastal hills, but the young wolf was canny, splitting his men into several smaller parties. Skirmishes erupted across the Westerlands, some small and inconclusive, others more brutal. Jaime directed his men with lethal precision. He was no brilliant strategist like Tywin, but he could read the flow of battle and exploit weaknesses with a swordsman's instincts. Whenever Jaime drew his blade, he felt an electric thrill. He led charges with fearless vigor, fighting at the front of the lines. His men followed him, hearts aflame with the boldness of their commander. Rumor spread that the kingslayer had personally cut down half a dozen knights in one engagement, that no one could stand against him steel to steel. His knights roared with pride. The small folk whispered that the ghost of the Mad King's vengeance followed him, but Jaime paid it no mind. Through it all, he glimpsed the ravages of war. Villages burned, crops trampled, corpses left to rot in the fields. He tried to keep his men disciplined, but in the chaos of battle, atrocities occurred. Prisoners were sometimes executed rather than ransomed. Jaime wrestled with the knowledge that he was leading the devastation. Each day, he assured himself that if the Stark armies marched unopposed, the Westerlands would suffer even more. That was the justification for pressing forward, for every swing of his sword. And he told himself that once the war was done, perhaps the realm could know peace. But peace seemed a distant fantasy, overshadowed by the clangor of steel and the acrid smell of blood. At last, he contrived a plan to force a decisive engagement. Through scouts and carefully planted misinformation, he maneuvered one of Robb Stark's main columns toward a narrow valley near Ashmark. If the young wolf wanted to relieve one of his beleaguered garrisons, he would have to pass that way. Jaime's men prepared an ambush, concealed along the ridges, while a smaller contingent was sent to draw the Stark forces into the trap. As twilight deepened, Jaime positioned himself at the valley's western end, scanning for any sign that his ruse had succeeded. Night fell, the moon emerged, and shadows stretched long across the rocky terrain. Tension coiled in Jaime's gut. If Robb Stark recognized the trap, Jaime might be the one ensnared. Torches flickered on the opposite slope. Shapes advanced. The call of a dire wolf echoed in the distance, haunting and fierce. Jaime's men looked at each other uneasily, the hush of the night amplifying every scrape of metal. Then came the sound of horns, the cry of men, and the sudden clash of armies. The valley lit up with the violence of warfare. Jaime mounted his charger, signaled his knights, and charged from concealment. His force slammed into the Stark outriders, cutting them off from retreat. Chaos erupted. Swords rang, horses screamed, men died. Jaime's adrenaline surged. He guided his horse through the fray, swinging left and right, feeling the jolt of impact each time steel met flesh. The plan seemed to be working. The Stark column was disorganized, pressed from multiple angles. Victory was within reach. Then, through the blood haze, Jaime caught sight of Grey Wind, Robb Stark's direwolf, snarling and snapping at soldiers on the flank. The beast leapt onto a Lannister banner carrier, dragging the man to the ground. Nearby, a tall figure in a mail cloak shouted commands. Robb Stark himself, eyes ablaze. The young wolf brandished his sword, rallying his men despite the ambush. Jaime spurred his charger forward, determined to test his mettle against the boy who had once outmaneuvered him. The royal of battle parted momentarily, and the two men locked gazes. Stark's sword was red with Lannister blood. Jaime felt a mix of fury and exhilaration. He spurred his horse faster, but the swirl of violence carried them in opposite directions before they could close for a duel. Soldiers pressed in between them. Jaime cursed, hacking down a northerner who lunged at him. He saw Grey Wind bounding away, men scattering in terror. The tide of battle became a storm, surging back and forth, each side fighting for advantage. For a moment, Jaime feared his trap might fail if the Starks regrouped. Rallying his knights, he led another charge at Stark's rear guard, determined to break them once and for all. Steel clashed, sparks flew, and men died in heaps. Then a horn blew. A deep, resonant note from the Stark side. It signaled a retreat. The Northerners began to pull back under the cover of darkness, dragging their wounded away. Jaime pressed hard, but the boy commander was canny, covering his withdrawal with mounted archers and that fearsome direwolf. By the time dawn broke, Stark's host was gone, leaving behind a battlefield strewn with the dead and dying. Surveying the carnage, Jaime felt neither triumph nor despair, only exhaustion. His men had won, at least in the sense that they retained control of the field. But Robb Stark had slipped away, bloodied but unbroken. It was not the decisive victory Jaime had hoped for. His body ached, and the stench of death clung to his armor. He dismounted, removing his helm. A hush fell over the remnants of his troops. In the aftermath, they sorted through the wounded, distinguishing friend from foe. Jaime offered what mercy he could. Prisoners were gathered. The injured were given water. A handful might be worth ransoming. The rest would be left to the maesters or to the stranger. War was hell, Jaime reflected, and all men were devils in its inferno. In the weeks that followed, skirmishes continued, but Robb Stark avoided direct confrontation, harassing Jaime's foraging parties and continuing his elusive tactics. Jaime sent reports to Tywin, though he suspected his father might be displeased that the young wolf had not been put down. The war dragged on, and Jaime found himself increasingly weary of the campaign. Where once he thrived on the clash of swords, now he felt a hollowness. He remained unstoppable in battle, but victory seemed fleeting, overshadowed by a sense that every triumph came at too great a cost. Occasionally, he caught himself imagining a life free from the weight of House Lannister, from the burden of reputation. But that was a child's fantasy. He was Jaime Lannister, the kingslayer, the heir to Tywin's legacy, the man who would live and die beneath the banner of the Golden Lion. Amid these dark days, a raven arrived from King's Landing bearing news. Marjorie Tyrell was to wed King Joffrey within the moon's turn, and all the great lords were invited to attend. Jaime found the summons pointed. Tywin wanted him back in the capital for the festivities, to show Lannister might and to keep Joffrey in check. Though Jaime preferred the battlefield to the political fray, part of him welcomed a reprieve. He entrusted command of his force to a capable bannerman, instructing him to hold the line. Then Jaime departed with a smaller retinue, heading southeast, leaving behind the scorched fields and unburied bodies. The journey back to King's Landing was fraught with uneasy thoughts. He wondered about Cersei, about her machinations, about the shape of court politics. He wondered if Tyrion still wrangled with the demands of being master of coin, or if Sansa Stark still endured her forced betrophal's humiliations. So many threads woven into the tapestry of power, each crossing the others in the tangled design of fate. Approaching the city, Jaime noticed the swelling crowds. The wedding promised to be a grand spectacle, with visitors from across the 7 kingdoms. Golden banners hung from the gates, and the streets bustled with merchants hawking wares. Jaime guided his horse through the throng, ignoring the occasional jeer or fearful whisper. He was the kingslayer, after all, and not all the common folk were fond of him. Passing the Lion Gate, he reached the Red Keep, where the guards saluted him with a mixture of awe and caution. Inside, he found the usual swirl of courtiers, servants, and visiting dignitaries. His father was not present. Tywin would arrive in a few days, once final preparations for the wedding were in place. Cersei was waiting for Jaime in her chambers. She dismissed her attendants, then stood before him, regal in a gown of deep crimson, her hair arranged in intricate braids. Jaime could see tension etched in her features. She offered a faint smile. "You've come back alive again," she said softly, scanning his face for injuries. She placed a hand on the scar along his forearm, as if reminded of how close he had come to losing everything. Jaime inclined his head. "They couldn't kill me," he replied with a wry smirk. Not for lack of trying. Her gaze flitted toward the door, as though expecting someone to eavesdrop. Then she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The wedding is only days away. Marjorie Tyrell has charmed half the court, and Joffrey is infatuated with her, or as close to infatuated as he can get. Father wants the ceremony to dazzle everyone, to secure the alliance. But the Tyrells are not to be trusted. We must watch them carefully, and watch Joffrey, too. He can be rash. Jaime nodded, remembering the Boy King's vicious streak. He felt that old protective pang, the paternal instinct twisted by secrecy. He placed a hand on Cersei's arm, but she withdrew slightly, her eyes flicking to a side passage. He understood. Any sign of undue intimacy could be disastrous. So they stood, an arm's length apart, exchanging unspoken words in the flicker of lamplight. The day of the wedding dawned bright. King's Landing was awash in color, with pavilions erected for feasting. The ceremony itself was held in the great September of Baelor, grand and imposing. Joffrey stood in gleaming finery, a crown of gold resting on his blonde curls. Marjorie Tyrell appeared in a gown that captured the entire court's admiration, bedecked in roses and jewels, projecting a gentle grace that belied her family's ambitions. Jaime stood with the rest of the Kingsguard, clad in white and gold, sword belted at his waist. He watched with a guarded expression, scanning the crowd for any hint of danger. Tyrion was there, wearing an ill-fitting doublet and a carefully maintained expression of wry detachment. Sansa Stark was present as well, though her gaze remained subdued, as though she were a ghost among living revelers. Grand Maester Pycelle intoned the words of the ceremony. Trumpets blared, and vows were exchanged. The feast afterward sprawled across the Red Keep's courtyards. Musicians played, jugglers performed, and tables groaned under the weight of extravagant dishes. Peacocks, gilded in gold leaf, were served to the delighted gasps of onlookers. Joffrey reveled in the attention, toasting himself more often than his bride. Marjorie smiled graciously, performing her role to perfection. Cersei watched with hawk-like intensity, occasionally whispering to Pycelle or exchanging glances with Tywin. Jaime moved through the crowd, greeting lords, accepting compliments, and ignoring the murmurs about his reputation. He was constantly alert, half expecting some drama to explode at any moment. He could see that Tyrion felt the same tension, sipping wine warily and keeping a careful distance from Joffrey's jests. When Joffrey rose to demonstrate his crossbow skill by firing bolts at a stuffed boar brought into the yard, a murmur went through the crowd. Some found it amusing, others unsettling. Joffrey demanded that Tyrion load the crossbow, humiliating him in front of the entire court. Jaime watched with clenched fists, itching to intervene. Yet he knew that any step out of line could provoke Joffrey further. The Boy King was in high spirits, but that could turn to cruelty in an instant. Tyrion handled the moment with dry dignity, loading the crossbow and stepping aside. Joffrey fired a bolt that struck the boar's eye to the drunken applause of a handful of sycophants. Marjorie forced a smile, attempting to direct Joffrey's attentions back to more civilized entertainments. Then the fateful moment arrived when Joffrey lifted a goblet of wine to his lips, drawing cheers from the crowd. He drained it in a flourish, smirking at Tyrion. The laughter turned to coughs. Joffrey's face contorted. In a horrifying instant, he began choking, clawing at his throat. A hush blanketed the courtyard before erupting into screams. Goblets toppled, chairs clattered. Cersei rushed forward, seizing Joffrey, her eyes wild. He collapsed, frothing at the mouth, eyes bulging in terror. Pandemonium seized the feast. People shoved tables aside, stepping on spilled food. Knights drew steel, uncertain against whom they should turn their swords. Marjorie gasped, stepping back with her ladies, horror etched on her features. Tyrion stood frozen, the goblet still in his hand, a dreadful tableau. Jaime felt a spike of fear surge through him. He raced forward, pushing aside lords and guards alike. He reached Joffrey's side, kneeling as the boy convulsed. Poison. It had to be poison. Jaime tried to support the king's head, but there was nothing he could do. Joffrey's skin turned a mottled purple, his breath choking off in violent spasms. Cersei wailed, her cry echoing like a banshee's shriek across the courtyard. All at once, the Kingsguard closed in. The guests scattered in panic, some trying to flee, others gawking in horrified fascination. Jaime locked eyes with Cersei, seeing the raw anguish that only a mother could feel. But behind that anguish, something snapped. She tore her gaze from him to focus on Tyrion, who was still standing with the goblet. "Arrest him!" she screamed, voice cracking with hatred. "He killed my son. Arrest him!" The gold cloaks hesitated, but Cersei's fury was absolute. The next moment, Tyrion was seized by half a dozen guards, the cup knocked from his hand. Jaime stood, stunned, uncomprehending. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Joffrey lay dead, or near enough, his eyes glazed. Everything else was chaos. Later, in the silent gloom of the Red Keep's halls, Jaime found himself in turmoil. The wedding feast had turned into a nightmare. Joffrey's body was placed in the September Tywin immediately convened an emergency council, though Cersei was too distraught to attend. Tyrion was dragged away in chains, accused of regicide. The Tyrells were incensed, but also suspiciously calm about the entire disaster. Whispers ran rampant. The usurper was dead. Someone had orchestrated the downfall of House Lannister from within. Ser Loras Tyrell glowered, demanding justice. Marjorie wept in the arms of her grandmother, the formidable Lady Olenna. The court was a hornet's nest of accusation, fear, and opportunism. Jaime, reeling, tried to keep his composure. He felt the ache of guilt twist in his gut. The boy had been his son. A monstrous child, perhaps, but still his blood. Jaime had failed to protect him. That failure struck deeper than any blade. Cersei was inconsolable. She raged, sobbed, cursed Tyrion's name. When Jaime tried to calm her, she shoved him away. "You were supposed to keep him safe," she spat, eyes red-rimmed and fierce. "All your skill with a sword, and you couldn't save our son." Jaime flinched as though struck. He wanted to protest that it was poison, that no sword could stop that. But he felt the weight of her words. He had told her he would protect Joffrey. He had promised. And now Joffrey lay on a bier, cold and still. The chance for fatherhood, twisted as it was, had vanished in a heartbeat. For once, Jaime felt powerless. He recalled every time he had scolded Joffrey for his cruelty, every time he had tried to guide him in the right direction. None of that mattered now. He was left with a gaping loss and a sense of having failed at something more important than kings and crowns. In the following days, the city was subdued, overshadowed by the murder of the king. Tywin moved swiftly to name Tommen the new king, pushing for a hurried coronation to stabilize the realm. Meanwhile, Tyrion languished in a dungeon, awaiting trial. Pycelle conducted his autopsy, confirming poison was the cause. Ser Dantos disappeared, rumored to have fled in the night. Littlefinger was absent, having departed on some urgent matter. Jaime found himself caught in the swirl of blame and speculation. Cersei demanded Tyrion's head. Sansa Stark had vanished in the chaos, implicating her further in the public eye. The Tyrells maintained a veneer of innocence, but Jaime could sense that beneath their polite expressions lay hidden relief or cunning. Varys watched silently, weaving his spider's web of information. And through it all, the people chanted, "The king is dead! Long live the king!" Jaime tried to speak to Tyrion, but the guards refused him entry to the cell at first. Only after Tywin intervened was he permitted to visit his brother, and even then the guards hovered near the door. Tyrion looked haggard, dark circles under his eyes, but he mustered a sardonic grin at Jaime's arrival. "So," Tyrion said, voice echoing in the damp cell, "the world thinks I killed the boy." Jaime felt an uncomfortable twinge. "Cersei is convinced of it," he said softly, glancing back at the guards. Tyrion shrugged, his tone bleak. "Of course she is. She's always believed the worst of me." Jaime studied his brother, searching for any sign of guilt. He found none, only weariness and a shadow of despair. "I didn't kill him, Jaime," Tyrion continued. "Hells, I saved the wretched little piece of our family's legacy more than once." Jaime nodded, remembering how Tyrion had tried to manage Joffrey's cruelty. "I know," Jaime whispered, "and I believe you." Tyrion let out a sigh that was almost a laugh. "Your belief isn't worth much, is it?" The unspoken truth lay between them. Tywin ruled, Cersei's wrath was unrelenting, and the trial would be a show. The question was whether Jaime could save Tyrion from the headsman. Sifting through the tangled plots that surrounded the king's death, Jaime recognized the hallmark of cunning conspirators. He suspected the Tyrells or perhaps Littlefinger. But with Joffrey gone, House Tyrell still stood to gain power through Marjorie's future. Meanwhile, the Lannisters reeled from the blow to their authority. Tommen was a pliable child. Tywin intended to mold him into a more agreeable king. Cersei's grief fueled her vendetta against Tyrion. Jaime had to walk a razor's edge between loyalty to his father, love for his sister, and the bond he felt with Tyrion. In stolen moments, Jaime's thoughts strayed to how differently everything might have gone if he had lost his hand. Would he even be here with the skill to defend Joffrey in that crucial moment? Or would events have played out the same, unstoppable as the turning of the seasons? The question gnawed at him, an echo of uncertainty he could never quite silence. As Tyrion's trial approached, the tension in the capital mounted. Crowds gathered, tongues wagged, and the rumor mills spun endless tales. Ser Meryn Trant and Ser Boros Blunt strutted about, basking in the possibility that Tyrion, who had frequently belittled them, might finally meet a gruesome end. Jaime loathed them for it but kept his peace, knowing any open challenge could weaken his influence. He attempted to reason with Cersei again, pleading for moderation, but she stood resolute in her conviction that Tyrion was a monster responsible for Joffrey's death. "He hated Joffrey," she insisted. "He mocked him, undermined him. You remember." Jaime, remembering Tyrion's attempts to guide Joffrey into less cruelty, found he could not argue effectively against the weight of her grief. Logic and heartbreak rarely shared a bed. On the day of the trial, the throne room was packed. Tywin presided as Hand of the King, flanked by Mace Tyrell and Prince Oberyn Martell, who had been granted a seat as a judge. Tyrion stood before them, dressed in dark clothing, his chin lifted in defiance. The gallery was filled with courtiers, curious lords, and restless small folk. Jaime positioned himself among the Kingsguard, though he wore his expression like a mask, betraying none of the turmoil within. Witness after witness came forward, each painting a damning picture of Tyrion's supposed motives. Cersei provided emotional testimony. Pycelle recited the details of the poison, suggesting Tyrion had been dabbling in deadly substances. Varys spoke in his usual careful riddles, neither absolving nor condemning Tyrion outright, though his words did little to help. It was all leading toward a grim conclusion. Jaime could see that Tyrion's fate was sealed unless something drastic changed. During a brief recess, Jaime confronted Tywin in private, his voice low but urgent. "You can't let them kill Tyrion. You know he's innocent." Tywin regarded him with cool detachment. "Publicly, it appears he is guilty. The city wants a culprit. The crown demands justice." Jaime fumed. "He's your son." Tywin's gaze hardened, reminiscent of stone walls. "He has always been a disgrace to our name." There it was, the unyielding truth of Tywin's heart. Jaime tried a different angle. "You need the family united. Killing Tyrion would drive a wedge between us." A shadow of calculation flickered in Tywin's eyes. "I might consider an alternative," he said slowly. "If you do your duty, leave the Kingsguard, inherit Casterly Rock, and ensure the line continues in a proper fashion." Jaime felt a jolt of anger and betrayal. Tywin was using Tyrion's life as a bargaining chip to force Jaime back into the role of heir and broodmare. The hypocrisy burned Jaime's throat. Yet if sacrificing his white cloak could save Tyrion, was he not bound to do it? Tyrion's outburst in the trial cut short Jaime's chance to intervene. Provoked by Shay's testimony, Tyrion unleashed a tirade that shocked the court, admitting he wished he had enough poison for them all. He demanded a trial by combat. The throne room erupted in chaos. Tywin's calm veneer cracked with annoyance. Jaime felt a strange mix of relief and dread. A trial by combat meant Tyrion had a chance, however slim, if he could find a champion who could defeat the crown's champion. But who would volunteer to fight for the imp, especially against a formidable warrior like the Mountain Gregor Clegane? Jaime considered stepping forward. He was unmatched with a sword, and he knew Tyrion's innocence. But he also knew Cersei would name the Mountain as the champion. If Jaime lost, he would die and Tyrion would die with him. That was the risk of trial by combat. The memory of how close he had been to losing his hand haunted him. But that had been under different circumstances. Now, with both hands intact, Jaime believed he could possibly best the Mountain. Still, the odds were uncertain. Gregor Clegane was a brute of monstrous strength and size, infamous for brutality on the battlefield. Jaime might be the realm's finest swordsman, but a single mistake could mean doom. Prince Oberyn Martell stepped forward, surprising everyone by declaring he would champion Tyrion. Oberyn had his own vendetta against the Mountain for past atrocities committed against the Martell family. Jaime watched, stunned. The Red Viper versus the Mountain, two legendary figures, each representing a lethal extreme of skill and power. Tyrion, exhausted but grateful, accepted Oberyn's offer. Cersei's lips thinned in displeasure, but she did not object openly. Tywin, seeing a chance to appease Dorne, allowed the arrangement. Jaime could only watch events unfold, both relieved that he was spared the necessity of fighting, but also terrified that Oberyn might fail. In the days leading up to the duel, the city buzzed with anticipation. Jaime spoke briefly with Oberyn, who exuded confidence in his agility and the lethality of his poison-tipped spear. Jaime offered a few pieces of tactical advice, reminding Oberyn not to underestimate the Mountain's brute force. Oberyn laughed in his face, showing the flamboyant arrogance of a man on a righteous mission. Tyrion awaited the combat in a guarded chamber, occasionally visited by Jaime. Their conversations were tinged with gallows humor, the two brothers acknowledging how quickly fate might swing. Tyrion asked Jaime if he thought Oberyn could win. Jaime hesitated. "He has skill," Jaime said carefully, "and a cause that fuels him, but the Mountain is the Mountain." Tyrion quirked an eyebrow, nodding grimly. When the day of the trial by combat arrived, the courtyard was packed. High lords and ladies crowded the stands, eager for spectacle. Tywin, Cersei, and other notables oversaw the event from a raised platform. Tyrion stood nearby, shackled but allowed to watch. Jaime took his place alongside the Kingsguard, though he felt more like a spectator. The Mountain loomed, clad in heavy armor, sword the size of a man's torso gripped in massive hands. Oberyn wore lighter armor, favoring mobility. The duel began, and Oberyn danced around Gregor, jabbing with his spear, landing nicks that drew blood. Each time, Oberyn demanded a confession for his slain kin. Gregor roared, swinging his blade in savage arcs that nearly obliterated anything in its path. The tension mounted as Oberyn gained the upper hand, slicing into the Mountain's flesh repeatedly. Victory seemed near when Gregor collapsed to one knee, apparently succumbing to poison. The crowd gasped. Oberyn circled triumphantly, pressing for confession. But in a final burst of enraged strength, Gregor seized Oberyn, crushing his skull with horrifying force. The courtyard erupted in screams of horror and dismay. Tywin immediately pronounced Tyrion guilty, sealing the imp's fate. Jaime stood paralyzed, horror riveted to the spectacle of Oberyn's gruesome end. Tyrion stared, ashen-faced, his hope shattered. In the aftermath, events moved quickly. Tywin ordered Tyrion's execution at sunrise. Jaime, outraged and despairing, confronted his father again, repeating his offer to leave the Kingsguard in exchange for Tyrion's life. Tywin scoffed. Oberyn's defeat had emboldened him. He no longer needed any bargain. Tyrion would die, and that was the end of it. Jaime refused to accept this. In the dead of night, he slipped into Tyrion's cell, resolved to save his brother. An uneasy conscience gnawed at him, but the bond of brotherhood overrode everything else. With a set of stolen keys and a cloaked figure's help, Varys, who else? Jaime freed Tyrion from his cell. Their parting was tense, filled with half-spoken regrets. Tyrion vanished into the darkness, left to navigate secret tunnels that would hopefully lead him to a waiting ship. Jaime remained, uncertain whether Cersei would ever forgive him or whether Tywin would discover his treachery. But saving Tyrion felt like the only right thing he had done in a long time. When dawn broke and the city learned of Tyrion's escape, an uproar followed. Tywin was livid. Cersei wept in fury. The gold cloaks searched the city high and low to no avail. Tyrion had disappeared as if swallowed by the earth. The guards suspected an inside job, but none could prove Jaime's involvement. Still, a rift widened between Jaime and his father, between Jaime and Cersei. When Jaime tried to speak to her, she met him with cold contempt. She accused him of siding with Tyrion, of betraying her and the memory of Joffrey. Jaime argued, voice raw, that Tyrion was family. But the wall she raised around her grief and anger was impenetrable. Soon, word reached them that Tywin had been found dead on the privy, shot with a crossbow. Rumors claimed Tyrion had done the deed before he fled. The city reeled at the news. Cersei collapsed into a vicious spiral of rage and sorrow. Jaime was left grappling with conflicting emotions. He mourned his father in some distant way, despised him in another, and wondered if Tyrion truly had found it in himself to commit patricide. In the power vacuum that followed Tywin's death, Cersei grasped for control. Tommen was crowned king, but Cersei essentially ruled as queen regent. Margaery Tyrell circled the throne like a cunning cat, seeking to ensnare Tommen for the Tyrell cause. Jaime remained Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, his skill still unmatched, but his place at Cersei's side was fraught with mistrust and resentment. He had saved Tyrion, the man she believed killed Joffrey, and she could not look at Jaime without seeing betrayal. Thus, while he had his sword hand, while he still walked as a paragon of martial prowess, Jaime felt more lost than ever. He patrolled the halls of the Red Keep at night, hearing his footsteps echo among memories of what might have been. Sometimes he visited the throne room when it was empty, gazing at the Iron Throne in silence. He remembered the Mad King's final moments, the gore on his blade, the terrible hush that followed. He remembered all he had sacrificed, all he had done. For what? The city was still steeped in treachery. His sister was consumed by her own brand of madness, and the boy he had tried to protect lay in a marble coffin. He wondered, in quiet moments, if losing his hand might have taught him a humbling lesson he desperately needed, whether that loss would have awakened a deeper compassion, a new sense of identity. Yet fate had chosen otherwise, and so he remained the kingslayer, undefeated, haunted. Sometimes he considered leaving it all behind, vanishing like Tyrion. But no, a knight did not flee his post. He had taken an oath to guard the king, to protect Tommen. Regardless of his conflicts with Cersei, he would uphold that vow. If Tommen's innocence offered any hope for the realm, then Jaime would fight to preserve it. He told himself it was the right thing to do. Perhaps it was all he had left to hold on to. Days became weeks. In King's Landing, the Game of Thrones continued unabated. Conspiracies took shape behind closed doors. The small council bickered. The faith militant rose, emboldened by the shifting powers. Rivals eyed the capital, sensing weakness. And Jaime, every morning, practiced in the yard, his sword strokes as fluid as a hawk in flight. Recruits watched in awe. Veteran knights remembered the younger Jaime, reckless and proud, and wondered if he had learned any humility. He still wore the gold and white of the Kingsguard with lethal grace, inspiring both fear and admiration. But inside, he felt a gnawing hollowness. The illusions he had once clung to were gone. His father lay dead. Joffrey too. Tyrion was in exile. Cersei was distant, consumed by her quest for power and vengeance. And Jaime remained, alone in spirit, bound to guard a kingdom that did not trust him. Sometimes he wandered to the dungeons, retracing the path he had taken to free Tyrion, letting his hand graze the cold stone walls. He remembered how it felt to choose principle or perhaps love over duty. Was that love? He was never certain. All he knew was that he had wanted to save Tyrion, to preserve some spark of decency in a world gone mad. The price had been the final estrangement from his sister. She rarely let him near Tommen now, fearing Jaime might betray them again. He accepted her distrust with silent resignation. Whispers reached him of dragons across the sea, of Daenerys Targaryen growing in power. He heard tales of the dead rising in the north. He heard rumors that Roose Bolton now ruled in Winterfell, that the Greyjoys still lurked on the coasts, that Dorne seethed after Oberyn's death. The realm was fracturing in ways that Tywin's iron grip had once prevented. Jaime, who had served as the sword arm of Lannister rule, found himself in a kingdom that seemed poised to collapse under the weight of its own fractures. And throughout it all, he carried that sense of disquiet, a knowledge that he had not atoned for the deeper sin of killing a king, nor for the countless lives lost in the wars that followed. If he had expected that retaining his hand would shield him from reckoning, he now understood how shallow that notion had been. Yet he did not lay down his sword. On the contrary, he continued to train relentlessly. His hand was steady, his grip unyielding. Whatever ghosts haunted his dreams, in waking life, Jaime remained a force to be reckoned with. Perhaps he told himself that skill with a blade was all he had left. He thought of Brienne of Tarth sometimes, that odd, loyal woman who had glimpsed some spark of humanity in him. In a world where he had never lost his hand, he had never traveled with her, never forged that strange camaraderie. Their paths had diverged. She was likely somewhere in the Riverlands or the Reach, carrying out her own quest. He felt a pang of something like regret, but that was a path not taken, a story that belonged to another life. The months passed. King Tommen's rule was overshadowed by Cersei's regency. She clashed with the Tyrells, with the Faith, with any who dared challenge her authority. Court intrigues multiplied. Jaime tried to counsel restraint, but Cersei spurned his advice. He was the kingslayer, the one who failed to save Joffrey, the traitor who freed Tyrion. She no longer confided in him. At times, she taunted him, reminding him of how he had changed, how captivity had eroded his once blind loyalty. He felt her words like a knife twisted in the dark corners of his heart. He missed the closeness they once shared, even if it had been a doomed, taboo love. But he could not unmake the choices he had made. Finally, the day came when Cersei overreached. She found herself ensnared by the Faith militant, arrested on charges of fornication and treasonable acts. The city buzzed with scandal. Jaime learned of it from a panicked servant. He demanded that the High Sparrow release her, but the Faith stood resolute. She would stand trial as any sinner must. Jaime might have attempted to storm the Great September, but he knew that would only end in violence. He found himself once again powerless to protect someone he loved. The memory of Joffrey's death and Tyrion's predicament gnawed at him. What good was being the realm's greatest swordsman if the real battles were fought with secrets and piety? He turned to Kevan and Pycelle, trying to negotiate for Cersei's release, but the Faith demanded contrition and humility. Jaime raged at the injustice. He envisioned slicing through the ranks of the Faith militant, but that would spark a civil war within the city. Days stretched into weeks as Cersei languished in a cell. Jaime grew more haunted, skipping meals, training until exhaustion overcame him. He wrestled with the knowledge that everything he had fought for, his family's legacy, his lover's power, the safety of his children, was slipping away. He had his sword hand, yet he could not cut through the intangible chains that bound them all. Finally, word came that Cersei had confessed certain sins to the High Sparrow to secure a measure of release. She would undergo a walk of atonement. Jaime felt a cold sickness in his gut. He wanted to stop it, but even Tommen did nothing, paralyzed by religious fervor and outside influence. On the appointed day, Jaime stood helpless as his sister was stripped and forced to walk naked through the streets, pelted by jeers and filth. He could not meet her eyes, knowing she would see his failure. He, who had once been her shield, could only watch from afar, powerless against a tide of righteous fury. When at last she stumbled back into the Red Keep, broken and bleeding, Jaime approached her. She looked at him with hollow eyes, stripped of the veneer of pride. For a moment, there was a flicker of the old bond between them, two siblings who had loved each other against all sense or morality. Then she turned away, refusing his comfort. He left her to Qyburn and the silent maids, his heart a knot of guilt and sorrow. In the days that followed, Jaime moved like a ghost through the corridors. A swirl of new intrigues rose around Cersei's upcoming trial by combat. She refused to be judged by the faith, demanding her right to trial by combat. Jaime half considered fighting for her himself, but he was not sure she would even want him to champion her. Besides, there were rumors of Qyburn's monstrous creation, Ser Robert Strong, who would serve as her champion. Meanwhile, the realm continued its downward spiral. Winter approached. The war-torn countryside braced for cold and famine. Whispers of White Walkers reached even King's Landing, though few believed them. And all the while, Jaime wrestled with the sense that destiny was slipping through his grasp. One late afternoon, he found himself standing on the battlements, gazing at the setting sun. The sky bled orange and purple. He took off his white cloak and folded it carefully, resting it on the cold stone. Beneath, he wore the red and gold of House Lannister. He flexed the fingers of his right hand, recalling the countless times he had swung a sword with lethal grace. He remembered the day he slew the Mad King. He remembered the day he nearly lost his hand in captivity, only to be spared by some twist of fate. He remembered the day he walked back into King's Landing, a scar on his forearm instead of a stump at his wrist, determined to remain the man he had always been. But who was that man now? A hero? A villain? A brother? A father? A lover? A knight? A kingslayer? In the end, he could only be Jaime Lannister. He saw the realm fracturing around him, and he understood that all the skill in the world with a blade could not mend it. He saw his father's grand ambitions undone by poison and betrayal. He saw his sister undone by her own ruthless drive. He saw Tyrion cast out, perhaps the only one of them with a functioning moral compass, however skewed. And he saw himself, standing on the edge of the Red Keep, feeling empty. Below him, the city sprawled in an uneven jumble of rooftops and narrow alleys. If he listened closely, he could hear the murmur of 1,000 lives, each with its own story. The wind ruffled his hair. He closed his eyes, remembering that old dream of knighthood's purity, the vow to protect the innocent. Could he still claim to believe in that dream? The sound of footsteps broke his reverie. A young squire approached, bowing low. "Ser Jaime, the Queen Dowager requests your presence." Jaime nodded, retrieving his cloak. He followed the lad down winding steps and across torchlit halls. The future remained uncertain. The realm perched on the cusp of winter, but duty called him once again. Whatever fate the gods wove for House Lannister, Jaime would meet it with steel in hand. He would face the consequences of all he had done and all he had left undone. He would remain a knight of the Kingsguard, for better or worse, until his final breath. And with every step he took, he felt the subtle weight of a choice that had seemed so small yet changed everything. He had never lost his sword hand. He had retained his fabled skill, and so the realm knew the same proud, dangerous Jaime Lannister. If only pride and skill were enough to save a kingdom from itself. He entered Cersei's chambers, finding her seated by a window, wrapped in a thick robe, staring at nothing. Her hair had been shorn during her walk of atonement, leaving her once glorious locks raggedly short. Her eyes flicked to Jaime as he approached. Silence stretched between them. He saw the raw vulnerability in her posture. Perhaps she wanted comfort. Perhaps she wanted revenge. "Close the door," she whispered. Jaime obeyed, stepping nearer. She studied him with an unreadable expression. "I have lost too much," she said softly. "Our son, our father, my dignity, everything I've done I did for us, for our children. Yet we stand here with nothing but ashes." Jaime did not speak. He wanted to say that they still had each other, But he was not sure that was true. She stared at his hand, his whole strong, deadly hand. "It seems the gods won't take that from you," she said with a bitter smile. "Not yet, at least." Jaime swallowed. He thought of the countless times he'd called himself a lion, a proud champion. Now that pride felt brittle. Cersei turned back to the window. The light caught the hint of tears in her eyes. Jaime almost reached for her but stopped, recalling how she had pushed him away. He whispered her name, but she did not respond. Something irrevocable lay between them now, a chasm carved by grief, betrayal, and guilt. He thought of how close he had come to losing his hand, how that might have forced him onto a different path. But this was the path he had, the life he led. He closed his eyes and let silence hold them both, unspoken regrets swirling in the dim air. The city hummed outside, heedless of their pain. Soon, winter's chill would descend on the entire realm, and war or peace or both would shape the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. Jaime only knew that he would remain who he was, with his perfect, deadly sword hand, until the day he died. He left her chambers eventually, the unspoken words lingering. He roamed the corridors, greeting guards who bowed stiffly. Down in the yard, he found the hush of night settling over the practice dummies and racks of weapons. He unsheathed his sword, letting moonlight caress the steel. In a single clean motion, he made a series of cuts through the empty air, each stroke precise, each pass a testament to years of discipline. The blade caught the moon's reflection, casting a brief flicker of light on the ground. Jaime exhaled, his breath ghosting in the cold. The night offered no answers, only the infinite hush of a realm teetering on the brink. But he would stand ready, sword in hand, to face whatever storm approached. That was all he had ever known. To fight, to endure, to cling to the slender thread of survival in a world where fate loved its cruel jokes. And if the wind carried the faintest echo of mockery or regret, Jaime Lannister, with both hands intact, would still raise his sword against the darkness, unbroken yet not entirely whole.